The dust in Vance's tomes and curios smelled of dry paper, old leather, and the sweet, faint decay of glue. I had learned to love that smell. It was the scent of 40 years of quiet peace. But today, it was polluted by the sharp, impatient scent of my children's expensive cologne and their overriding demand. "Sell it, Mother." "It's worthless." The air in my store was always still. It smelled of dry paper, old leather, and the sweet, faint decay of glue in the bindings. Dust coated the tops of the shelves so high they almost touched the tin ceiling. The light from the front window was weak, just strong enough to catch the particles floating in the air. My fingers, stiff from the morning chill, worked a thin coat of adhesive into the cracked spine of a 19th century copy of Persuasion. The silence was comfortable. It was broken only by the scrape of my bone folder and the rumble of a city bus passing outside on the street. Then the bell above the door chimed. The sound was too sharp. It cut through the quiet. I looked up. Mark and Chloe. Mark, my son, was 53. He stood just inside the doorway, his expensive wool coat still buttoned. He rocked back on his heels, his eyes scanning the stacks, not with interest, but with calculation. Chloe, my daughter, was 48. She clicked inside on sharp heels, stopping short of the main aisle. She pulled a tissue from her purse and wiped her fingertips as if just touching the air had soiled them. "Mother," Mark said. His voice was loud. "Too loud for the shop. We need to talk." I placed the bone folder down. "I'm working, Mark." "Right. Working." He let out a short, sharp breath. "You had 2 customers yesterday." I checked the logs. 2. "This place isn't a business. It's a graveyard." "I like the quiet," I said, capping the adhesive. "It's embarrassing, Mom," Chloe said. She wouldn't look at me. Her eyes were fixed on a stack of biographies. "My friends ask what you do. I have to tell them you sit in this musty old building all day. This place was your father's," I said, my voice quiet. "It's my home. It's not for sale." Mark finally moved, walking toward the counter. He stopped and brushed dust off a stack of poetry. "It's not a home, it's prime downtown real estate. You're sitting on $1 million lot, hoarding it." "We have an offer, Mom," Chloe said, her voice suddenly high and thin. "A very good offer, from a developer. Enough to get you a nice apartment. A new one, clean, and enough for you?" I asked. Chloe's face tightened. "This isn't about me. This is about your future. You're 77. You can't keep doing this." "This is what I do," I said. Mark slapped his hand on the counter. The sound made me jump. The old cash register trembled. "It's worthless." "Everything in here is worthless." "You're being selfish, Mother. You are hoarding an asset you have no right to." I stood up slowly. My knees ached. "I have every right. Your father left it to me, not to you, not to a developer." Mark stared at me. His face was cold, his eyes flat. He looked so much like a man I used to know, but without any of the warmth. "We're done discussing this," he said. He pulled his phone from his pocket and looked at it. "We're holding a family meeting, tomorrow, 10 a.m., right here." "A meeting?" "With the lawyer," he said, not looking up. "We're done asking." Chloe moved to his side. She finally met my gaze. There was no sympathy in it, just impatience. "It's for the best, Mom. You'll see." They left. The bell chimed again. The heavy door shut with a solid thud. The silence rushed back in, but it wasn't comfortable anymore. It was heavy. I stood there for a long time. A single hot tear traced a line down my cheek, tasting like salt and dust. My gaze drifted from the door, past the biographies, past the history section, to the back wall. It was a dark, unassuming corner, filled with old sci-fi paperbacks, books from the 70s and 80s, their covers bright and strange. I looked at that specific shelf. Tomorrow, 10 a.m. I slept poorly. When I arrived at the shop just before 9, I saw it. Staked into the small patch of grass by the walkway was a large plastic sign. Red letters on a white background. For sale. Commercial real estate. A phone number I recognized as Mark's. My hand trembled as I put the key in the lock. I pushed the heavy door open, went inside, and turned the lock behind me. I did not take the sign down. I left it there, a monument to their greed. I spent the next hour in the back room making a pot of tea. I tried to read the morning paper, but the words blurred. I just sat, listening to the old building settle and groan. The clock on the wall ticked. Each click was a second closer to 10. At 10:02, the bell chimed. I walked out from the back. They were all there. Mark, Chloe, and a third man. He was a short, nervous man in a suit that was too large in the shoulders. It was a cheap synthetic material that shined under the weak overhead lights. He carried a worn leather briefcase. "Mother," Mark said, gesturing to the man. "This is Mr. Hemlock, our attorney." "My attorney," I corrected, walking behind my counter. "Not yours." Mr. Hemlock gave a short, practiced cough. He stepped forward and placed his briefcase on the counter, snapping the latches open. "Mrs. Vance, my name is Arthur Hemlock. Your children have retained me. They are concerned." "Concerned," I repeated. The word felt flat and dead. "For your well-being," he continued. He pulled out a thick sheaf of papers. "They believe you are no longer capable of managing your own finances. Specifically, this asset." He tapped the counter. "This property." I looked at Mark, at Chloe. They stood side by side, a united front. "He's here to help you, Mom," Chloe said. Her voice was too bright. Mr. Hemlock slid the papers across the counter. "This is a petition for power of attorney. It would give Mark and Chloe the legal right to manage your estate, to facilitate the sale of this building for your own future security." I looked down at the paper, at the line at the bottom, waiting for my name. "You're trying to have me declared incompetent." My voice was low. I could feel a cold vibration in my chest. "You are trying to take my home." "We're trying to save you, Mom." Chloe's voice cracked, the brightness gone. This life you have, it's pathetic. What do you have to show for it?" "Dust! Nothing! You sit here and you rot." "Enough, Chloe," Mark said, but there was no force in it. "No," she said, stepping closer. "I'm tired of pretending this is okay. It's not. We have a right to our inheritance. We have a right to not be embarrassed by our own mother." "A right," I said. The words tasted like ash. "You have a right." I looked at Mark. "And you? You agree with this? This petition?" Mark crossed his arms. "It's a practical solution, Mother." "You're emotional. This is a business decision, and you're not a business person. You're sitting on a gold mine and letting it flood. This is the only way." "The only way," I whispered, looking at their faces. My children. The argument hung in the air, thick and sour. The lawyer, Mr. Hemlock, looked down at his shoes, clearly wishing he were somewhere else. It was in that heavy silence that we heard it, a sound. Not a bus, not a truck. It was a low, smooth purr, the sound of expensive high-end engines, more than one. The sound grew, then stopped, right outside the store. Chloe was the first to look. Her argument died in her throat. Her eyes went wide. "Mark?" "Oh my God!" Mark turned, annoyed. "What now?" He looked past her, out the front window, past his own for sale sign. His face went pale. "What is that?" Chloe whispered, fumbling in her purse for her phone. "Is that?" "That's a Rolls-Royce. And 2 Escalades. Black." Mark straightened his tie. A new, sudden energy lit his face. "It's him. It must be the developer. The real one." He shot a look at me. "Mother, do not say one word. I will handle this." A man in a dark suit and earpiece got out of the first car. He scanned the street, then opened the rear door of the second vehicle, a long, silent electric SUV. A man stepped out. He was young, perhaps in his mid-30s. He wore simple dark trousers and a plain gray t-shirt. He was unmistakable. Chloe dropped her phone. It clattered loudly on the wooden floor. "That's," she stammered. "That's Julian Thorne." Mark's jaw was slack. The tech billionaire? From the space company. He must be the developer," Mark said again, a manic grin spreading on his face. "He's buying the whole block. Mother, this is it." The bell on the door chimed. Julian Thorne stepped inside. His security guard stayed at the door. He ignored Mark, Chloe, and the lawyer. He ignored the papers on my counter. His eyes scanned the shop. He wasn't looking at the real estate. He wasn't looking at the ceiling height or the square footage. He was looking at the shelves. He breathed in the dusty air. He looked like he was in a church. Then his eyes landed on me. He froze. Julian Thorne walked toward my counter. His eyes were wide, taking in the thousands of books. He moved slowly, deliberately, as if he were afraid of breaking the stillness of the air. Mark stepped forward, his hand outstretched, a forced, eager smile plastered on his face. "Mr. Thorne, Mark Vance. I manage this property. Thank you for flying in. My mother was just agreeing to the sale, so we can move this process along for you." Thorne didn't even glance at Mark. He held up his hand, a universal gesture to stop, and kept walking. He reached the counter. His entire focus was on me. He wasn't looking at the papers Mr. Hemlock had left out. He held a book in his left hand. It was a paperback. The cover was faded, the spine deeply creased. It was a book that had been read hundreds of times. It was the Ethelberg Binary. "Mrs. Vance," he said. His voice was not the booming voice I heard in news clips. It was quiet and humble. "I am," I replied. He laid the book on the counter, next to the lawyer's papers. The lurid orange and blue cover was a stark contrast to the thick white legal forms. "I flew from my launch site in Kazakhstan," Thorne said. "I had to divert the jet and charter a smaller plane just to get here quickly." Chloe scoffed, still trying to grasp the reality of the situation. "You flew across the world for a second-hand paperback?" Thorne turned to Chloe. His expression was utterly serious. "I've read this book 47 times. I first read it when I was 13. I was living in a group home then. This book is the reason I learned to code. It's the reason I studied physics. It's the entire philosophical framework for my company. Everything I have built, every rocket, every line of code started with this book." He tapped the cover. "It was published 40 years ago. So what?" Mark cut in, his voice desperate. "It's an old book. My mother should sell the shop to you. That's why you're here, right? To buy the lot." "No," Thorne said simply. "I didn't come here to buy real estate." He opened the worn book to the title page. "This book's author is listed as A.S. Peregrine, a legendary pseudonym. They published this one, perfect novel, and then vanished. They refused every single royalty payment, directing them all into an anonymous trust." He looked back at me, his eyes gleaming. "No interviews, no photos, no public appearances. A.S. Peregrine became a ghost." I felt the blood drain from my face. I looked past Thorne, at my children. Chloe was slowly shaking her head. Mark stood utterly still. The lawyer, Mr. Hemlock, was trying to make sense of the names. "I've spent millions over the last decade trying to find Peregrine," Thorne continued. "I had my forensics and security team track the trust. They finally broke the firewall last week." He spoke the next words slowly, clearly, so everyone in the quiet shop could hear them. "We traced the trust's one and only expenditure. Every year. It paid the property tax and the utility bills for one location. This location, Vance's Tomes and Curios." A terrible silence descended. The only sound was the distant rumble of the city. Chloe finally connected the missing parts. Her eyes widened, horrified. She whispered. She stared at me, then down at the worn book. "Ilara, Annabelle, Vance." She put a hand to her mouth. A.S. Peregrine. Peregrine was grandmother's maiden name. Mark's face was chalk white. He looked from the billionaire to me, then back to the book. His $1,000,000 deal, his certainty that this shop and I were worthless, was collapsing around him. Thorne picked up the silver pen from his jacket pocket and placed it next to the book. His expression was profound, almost supplicating. "I didn't come here to buy your store, Mrs. Vance," he repeated, his voice barely audible. "I came here to ask you, after 40 years of anonymity, would you please do me the honor of signing my book?" My children were speechless. The lawyer was backing away slowly toward the door. The only one who moved was me. I reached out and picked up the silver pen. I held the silver pen. It was heavy, cool metal against my palm. I had not signed the name A.S. Peregrine in 40 years. The tension in the shop was suffocating. Mark and Chloe stood like statues watching me. Mr. Hemlock was halfway to the door, fiddling with his briefcase handle. Julian Thorne waited. He stood completely still, watching my face, not the book. I looked at my children. Mark's jaw was locked. The earlier contempt was gone, replaced by a confusion that was rapidly turning into something close to panic. Chloe's eyes were glistening, a mix of shock and the sudden, terrible calculation of a new opportunity. They had called this life worthless. Now, they understood its actual value. I pressed the tip of the pen lightly against the faded title page. I wrote the initials first, A.S. My hand was steady. Then the surname, Peregrinei, lifted the pen. Julian Thorne slowly reached out, his fingers hovering over the book. Then he gently took it. He stared at the signature for a long time. He closed his eyes for a moment, then opened them. He looked like a man who had completed a lifelong quest. "Mrs. Vance," he said, his voice husky. "Thank you. This is everything." He put the book carefully into an inner pocket of his jacket. He turned to Mark and Chloe. They flinched. "The book is a classic," Thorne said, speaking directly to them for the first time. The themes of self-determination, the rejection of corrupt institutions, and the power of knowledge, it changed the way my generation viewed the future. It's required reading for every employee at my company. The author is, frankly, one of the most influential minds of the last century. Mark found his voice. It was strained and high-pitched. "Mr. Thorne, sir, I apologize for the misunderstanding. We were just discussing business. As her son, I can assure you that any future business dealings with Mrs. Vance will be handled with the utmost professionalism." Mark took a step toward Thorne, putting himself between the billionaire and me. He was trying to pivot, trying to insert himself into this new, profitable reality. Thorne looked at Mark's outstretched hand and ignored it, just as he had before. "I am not a fan of corrupt institutions." "Mr. Vance," Thorne said, his voice flat. He looked down at the paper still sitting on my counter. "The petition for power of attorney. My team tracked the activity here. I know exactly what you and your sister were attempting to do," Chloe gasped. "That's not fair! We were just worried about her well-being." "You called her life pathetic," Thorne stated. "You told her her home was worthless. You attempted to force her to sell." He looked at me. "Mrs. Vance, I want to acquire all remaining rights to the Ethelberg binary, electronic, dramatic, foreign language, everything. The trust only manages the original print royalties." "I want the complete package," Mark nearly shouted. "We can discuss terms, Mr. Thorne. I am her representative." I held up my hand, stopping Mark before he could take another step. I addressed Thorne. "Mr. Thorne, the royalties have funded this building's upkeep for 40 years. They are enough for me." "I know the figures," Thorne replied. "But think of the scope. Think of the foundation this money could create. A literary foundation, or perhaps a grant dedicated to young science writers, named after A.S. Peregrine." He paused, then added, "My company is prepared to offer $100 million for the full rights, effective immediately." The number hung in the air. $100 million. Mr. Hemlock dropped his briefcase. It hit the floor with a hollow thud. Mark looked like he was going to faint. Chloe actually put a hand out to steady herself on a bookshelf. They had been arguing over $1 million property sale. Now they were standing next to a $100 million transaction. $100 million, I said slowly. I looked at Mark's face, at Chloe's face. And the funds would go to a foundation, Mr. Thorne? Not to my personal estate? To a foundation of your choosing, Thorne confirmed. You can be its director. No one else has to know you are Peregrine. The terms would protect your privacy, absolutely. I felt a quiet satisfaction. This money, this value, would go anywhere but into the hands of the children who had called my life worthless 5 minutes ago. I accept your offer, I told Thorne, on the condition that the contracts are handled by a reputable firm and not by the man currently holding a petition to declare me incompetent. I glanced pointedly at Mr. Hemlock. Thorne smiled. He took a business card from his wallet. My legal team will contact your chosen counsel within the hour. It has been an honor, Mrs. Vance. He nodded to me, turned, and walked out. The security guard opened the door. The high-end engines revved once. The black cars pulled away from the curb. Mark and Chloe stared at the empty street. They were both breathing fast. The three of them stood in the sudden silence. The only sounds were Mr. Hemlock's nervous shuffling near the door and my own steady breathing. Mark recovered first. He spun toward me, his face now shiny with sweat and a desperate urgency. Mother, wait! 100 million? You can't just throw that away on a foundation. You have to talk to us. As your children, we are legally entitled to discuss this capital. I leaned forward on the counter, resting my hands on the smooth, cold wood. The capital is going into a foundation, Mark, a science and literature grant. As I told Mr. Thorne, the funds will not go into my personal estate. But, Chloe stammered, stepping forward, we can set up a different kind of trust. A family trust. You could still manage it, but we could be the beneficiaries. Think of the tax implications. You called my life pathetic, I reminded her. You called this shop worthless. You stood here, both of you, trying to declare me incompetent to manage my own affairs, simply so you could sell the asset. Why would I give you a share of my competence? Mark took a step closer to the counter, his hands opening and closing into fists. This is not fair. We are your family. That money is our birthright. Your birthright, I said, my voice empty of emotion, was your father's share in this bookstore, which I am still running, and which you begged me to sell for a fraction of what this lot is worth. Mr. Hemlock, seeing the situation had escalated far beyond a simple property dispute, decided to make his exit. He clutched his briefcase and scurried out the door without a word. The chime was brief and final. Mark turned, looking out at the spot where the black cars had been. I'll call his office. He said his team would contact your counsel. Who is your counsel? We can meet them together. I'll be there. I don't have counsel, I said. I haven't needed one in 40 years. Mark stared at me, dumbfounded. Mr. Thorne said his team would contact my chosen firm, I continued. I will call a firm now. I will choose a lawyer who specializes in foundations and intellectual property law. I assure you, neither of you will be present for that conversation. Chloe began to cry, small, hitching sobs that were clearly about the money, not about me. Mom, please. We didn't mean it. We just thought you were struggling. Struggling, I repeated. I reached under the counter and pulled out the old cash register log, the physical book where I wrote down my 2 customers a day. I opened it. The royalty payments were always enough to cover the utilities, the property tax, and my living expenses. I never needed your help. I simply needed you to leave me alone. Mark pulled his phone out again, dialing quickly. I'm calling the paper. I'll tell them the author has been found. You can't keep this secret and the money away from us, Mother. The press will find a way to make you talk. They won't, I said simply. Mr. Thorne's contract is explicit on the protection of my identity. That was my primary condition. He respects privacy. Unlike you. I walked toward the back room. Where are you going? Mark demanded. To find a lawyer, I replied, and to make some tea. I believe you should leave now. I have a very important phone call to make, and I require silence. I walked through the back door and closed it firmly behind me. I heard Mark shouting something, then the sound of Chloe's sharp cry. I didn't open the door again. I sat down at the small wooden desk where I had drafted the Ethelberg binary 40 years ago. I picked up the phone. I smiled for the first time that day. I knew exactly which law firm I was going to call. They had nowhere to go. They had no claim. They were trapped in the silence of the shop they had called worthless. I spent the next 3 hours in the back office. I spoke with a high-profile intellectual property lawyer in New York. I outlined the offer from Julian Thorne and his company. The lawyer was excited, professional, and promised discretion. He confirmed the immediate need for a robust, non-disclosure agreement protecting my identity as A.S. Peregrine. When I finally emerged, the shop was quiet. Mark and Chloe were gone. The lawyer's papers, the petition for power of attorney, were still on the counter. The contract was null now. I walked to the front window. The red and white "For Sale" sign that Mark had erected was still there, leaning slightly in the grass. I looked at it for a moment, then went to the counter and picked up the phone. I called a local landscaping company, one I had used years ago for minor work. The owner answered. I requested an emergency service. I asked them to come immediately and remove the large sign from the front lawn of the bookstore and dispose of it. I told them I would pay double the normal rate. The owner happily agreed. While I waited, I moved the stacks of books Mark had carelessly touched, smoothing the covers and dusting the shelves. I was careful not to disturb the specific shelf in the science fiction section. That shelf held the original, printed-on-demand manuscript of the Ethelberg binary, the copy I had used to ship to the publisher 40 years ago. A half-hour later, a rusty pickup truck arrived. 2 young men jumped out and efficiently ripped the sign from the ground. It made a tearing sound as the plastic came loose. They tossed it into the back of their truck. Mark's phone number vanished with it. I paid them in cash and watched the truck drive away. Just as the sun began to set, painting the dusty windows in shades of gold and orange, the phone rang. It was Mark. I let the phone ring 4 times before I answered. Mother, where were you? His voice was hoarse. We waited for hours. Chloe is hysterical. We went to the lawyer, Hemlock, but he won't talk to us. He's scared. I was busy, I said. I spoke with my new lawyer. They are finalizing the terms of the foundation with Mr. Thorne's legal team. It's moving very quickly. This is ridiculous, he yelled. You can't just cut us out. That's $100 million. You will die someday, Mother, and that foundation will simply absorb the capital. We should be on the board. We should manage the grants. The terms of the foundation state that the director must be someone who possesses a profound understanding of the source material's philosophical and scientific underpinnings, I said, reciting a clause the New York lawyer had just drafted. That excludes both of you. There was a long silence on the line. I could hear Chloe weeping faintly in the background. You really did this, Mark whispered. You lived here for 40 years, letting us think you were a pathetic failure just so you could pull this at the end. I lived here because I liked the silence, I corrected him. And I like books, and I paid my own way. You invented the pathetic failure part all by yourselves. I heard a heavy thud on Mark's end of the line, as if he had thrown something. You never cared about us, he accused. I cared about you enough to give you a loving home until you were adults, I said. But I owe you nothing more than my own peace. And you tried to take that, "We will fight this," Mark said, his voice flat with cold rage. "We will find a way." "You can try," I said. "But you will be fighting Julian Thorne's entire legal department and an $80 million foundation, all to prove that your 77-year-old mother is an influential genius." "I wish you luck with that argument." I hung up the phone. I stood behind the counter, the last rays of sun fading. I reached out and gently ran my hand over the dark, dusty wood. I could feel the old life of the shop, the quiet hum of secrets kept. The store wasn't worthless. It was invaluable, and the dust was simply the patina of 40 years of peace. I smiled to myself, a small, genuine smile. Tomorrow, the new life would begin. The quiet returned to the shop. It was the deep, satisfying quiet I had known for decades, only now it felt earned. The next morning, I arrived early. I pulled my gloves on and finally walked out to the small patch of grass where Mark had staked the sign. I got down on my knees and pulled out the remaining small tufts of brown, dead grass the sign had left behind. I patted down the soil. I would buy some flower seeds later. The following days were a blur of paperwork. Thorne's legal team was impeccable. My new lawyer drafted the charter for the A.S. Peregrine Science and Literature Grant, specifying that it would support writers exploring the intersection of technology and human philosophy. The principal of $100 million would be managed by a private financial trust, with me as the director. Mark and Chloe tried several times to intervene. They called my lawyer. They sent me emails. They even showed up at the store, only to find the door locked. I had put up a small sign, "Closed for inventory." On Friday, a heavy packet of final contracts arrived via certified courier. I sat at my counter and signed the documents, sealing the deal. That evening, I poured a cup of tea and walked back to the sci-fi section. I found the original manuscript copy of the Ethelberg Binary. I pulled it off the shelf. It was a spiral-bound notebook, its cover thick, clear plastic. Inside, the pages were filled with my youthful, careful handwriting. 40 years ago, I had worked out the physics and the philosophical questions in this book, questions that had formed the basis of Julian Thorne's modern empire. I sat down and opened it to a random page. I saw a passage I had almost forgotten about the necessity of maintaining personal, sovereign space even in a crowded, modern world. That was why I had hidden in plain sight. That was the value I had protected. The back door chimed. I rarely used that entrance. I walked through the back office and opened the door. It was Chloe. She was alone. She looked haggard and pale. "Mom," she whispered. Her eyes were puffy. "They won't talk to us. Your lawyer said we have no standing. None. He sent us the foundation charter." "You really did it." She stepped inside the office, then stopped, looking at the worn desk. "You wrote the book here, didn't you? All of it?" I nodded. "I can't believe it," she said, shaking her head slowly. 40 years. You were A.S. Peregrine, and you never said anything." "It wasn't their business," I said. "And it wasn't yours. But why here? Why not tell anyone?" I put the manuscript down on the desk. "Because if you have something truly valuable, you protect it. You don't sell it, you don't boast about it, and you certainly don't let it be defined by the market." She looked at me, and for the first time, I saw a flicker of understanding, not greed in her eyes. It vanished quickly, replaced by a deep sadness. "I'm in serious debt, Mom," Chloe admitted. "I came to ask, not for the store, but for help, just enough to keep the bank away." I walked to the safe hidden behind the cleaning supplies. I opened it. I took out a checkbook from my personal account. The account where the original royalties, enough for my simple living, accumulated. I wrote a check for a modest amount, enough to clear her immediate and most pressing debt, but not enough to change her lifestyle. I handed it to her. She looked at the amount, then back at me. I don't know what to say. Don't thank me, I said. This is not charity. It's a loan. You will pay it back. I expect payments monthly starting next month. I met her gaze. And if you ever call my life worthless again or try to take what isn't yours, I will use every resource of the A.S. Peregrine Foundation to take this back and more. Chloe swallowed, clutching the check. I understand. I won't. Thank you, Mom. She left quietly through the back door. No sharp heel clicks. No loud chime. I walked back into the main shop. I looked around at the towering shelves, the beautiful dust, the quiet sanctuary. I was not just a Lara Vance, the elderly bookseller. I was the director of a major science and literature grant. I was A.S. Peregrine, but here I was just me, and I was home,